Hello everybody, my name is Kara, and today I'm here with a review for Wilde's Women, How Oscar Wilde Was Shaped by the Women He Knew by Eleanor Fitzsimons. This is a nonfiction book I read for the Irish Readathon, and as the title suggests, it's really about the important women in Oscar Wilde's life and how they contributed to his character and his life and his choices, and just the kind of person he was in general. And I had a lot of thoughts about this book, so I wanted to do a separate review. So I'm going to go over some things that I enjoyed about the book, some things I think could have been done better, and also a couple of things that didn't positively or negatively affect my opinion, but I guess just some things to note about the way that this book is structured or written. So the first thing I want to talk about is I was pretty surprised about the structure of this book, at least based on what I had read in the summary or online. To me, it kind of sounded like this book was going to focus on a few specific women in Oscar Wilde's life and then be organized very sequentially, I guess. Like there would be one section of the book maybe about his mother, one section about his wife, and so on and so on. And that's kind of what happened, but not really. The first chapter was actually about, I think it was Lily Langtry, who was a very well-known actress who Oscar Wilde knew very well and was very good friends with for quite a while. So the first chapter was about her, and then the next chapter was about Oscar Wilde's mother. And so then after that, I had kind of thought, okay, maybe every single chapter is going to follow a different woman that Oscar Wilde knew, and that also wasn't really true. There was quite a bit of time in the book devoted to Oscar Wilde's mother, Lady Jane Wilde. Her maiden name was LG, or LJ, I believe. So quite a lot of the book was about her life, and then a little bit about how her perspectives influenced Oscar, which I enjoyed, and I think that makes sense that his mother would be such a prominent focus of this book. And then there was another good portion of the book that was dedicated to his wife Constance, who I found really fascinating, and I definitely want to read more about her. But it was very interesting because the structure of the book wasn't quite consistent all the way through. But once I got used to that, I actually didn't mind it. I found it kind of gave a nice variety to the story because there would be a couple of chapters where we would spend time with a different figure in Oscar Wilde's life. So maybe somebody who didn't have quite as much of an impact on him as his mother or his wife, but still like a very important figure in her own right. So I enjoyed that we had those sections scattered throughout the book rather than doing everything about his mother, everything about Constance, and so on and so on. I also think that Eleanor Fitzsimons did a really good job of balancing the focus on Oscar Wilde with the focus on the women in his life. Because that is the focus of this book, is these specific women and their lives, and also how those lives intersected with Oscar Wilde, or how those women affected him in some way. So I liked that. I think there was a good balance. Some chapters had a lot more focus on the women, some chapters had a lot more focus on Oscar Wilde himself, but that felt pretty even-handed to me. Like there wasn't ever a point where I felt like we had lost sight of what the book was supposed to be doing. And then another thing about this book, and this is sort of a plus-minus situation, because there were some places where I really appreciated this and some places where it kind of dragged down the experience for me, and that is that this book is extremely detailed. And obviously that's something generally that you want in nonfiction. Like you want to be specific, you want to be particular with the facts that you are learning about or that the author is kind of interpreting. But I do think there were several places, especially in certain chapters or sections, where Eleanor Fitzsimons went way too far with the level of detail, because it just wasn't relevant. I especially noticed there were lots of times where she would kind of go off on this tangent about a person that she had brought up, who she was talking about, and she would give all of these layers of like distant connection to Oscar Wilde or to another person she had mentioned. And sometimes that was interesting, but a lot of times it kind of felt like, okay, but is the fact that this is this person's brother-in-law who then married Oscar Wilde's cousin and who then worked on like this production that he was going to work on and then didn't. So something like that. So I feel like that level of detail was kind of distracting, and it actually made the book kind of hard for me to get through at some points because some chapters felt especially bogged down in detail. But the flip side of that is that I really feel like I got a full picture of a lot of these people that Eleanor Fitzsimons was talking about. And actually some of my favorite sections or like moments in the book were those very detailed little side stories, or people that maybe didn't get a whole chapter devoted to them, but they had this really, really interesting connection to Oscar Wilde. I really enjoyed those. So I think overall I'm satisfied with the level of detail. Just be prepared that there is quite a bit of that. Although I also would say that depending on the particular people in the book or the focus that you find most interesting, we might have opposite opinions. Like I might have really enjoyed the sections that you felt were too detailed, and you might actually really get along with ones that I thought had too much information. So I think that one could depend on personal preference. And then even though it was detailed, I did find myself having trouble remembering who was who. And partly that was because I didn't sit down and read this book straight through. But the way it was set up, I kind of thought that it would lend itself well to reading a chapter here or there. And depending on the chapter, that was sometimes true. but there was a surprising amount of almost like story continuity that was necessary. And like, this is a nonfiction book, so I wasn't expecting that really. I did notice that if I put this book down to read something else for a few days or a week or whatever, next time I picked it up, I would have a hard time remembering who was who, and maybe that's on me as the reader. But I don't feel like Fitzsimons always did as thorough of a job as she could have of reminding us throughout the book of who the important figures were. But that being said, I also don't think I would have enjoyed this book more if I had read it straight through, because in some ways this book took a lot of work to read, and partly it was because of that excessive detail that I mentioned. So even though I wonder if a little bit of my struggling to remember who was due to me taking breaks, I also think that for me personally, taking breaks did contribute positively to my reading experience. And then something I was really impressed with throughout the book is the level of sympathy that Eleanor Fitzsimons portrayed Oscar Wilde and also his wife Constance with. I think Eleanor Fitzsimons did a great job of showing how difficult Oscar Wilde's life was. You know, he was a gay man living in a time where that was illegal. It really negatively affected obviously his mental and emotional health and just like his everyday life, and I think she did a great job of showing how wrong that was and how nobody should have to go through that, while at the same time allowing us to sympathize with his wife Constance because of the things that she went through, and the fact that even with all of that he was going through, it doesn't mean that he could treat his wife however he wanted. Like, he made some choices that really, really hurt his family, and Constance especially, and I think she did a good job of explaining the background for why he might have made that decision without excusing that. And that was just something I really appreciated, is that compassion and sympathy on both sides. And then a couple of notes about the book. These aren't plus or minus, like I didn't take points off or anything for these, but one thing I noticed is that the majority of this book is kind of overshadowed by us knowing how Oscar Wilde died and us knowing how sad his story ended up being. And like I said, I didn't take points off for this. It didn't like positively or negatively affect my opinion of this book, but I kind of thought based on the summary for this book that we weren't going to be as focused on that, because I think it's very important to remember what happened to him and to talk about that context and how that shouldn't have happened, and to acknowledge the horrible things that he went through. Like, I'm not saying we shouldn't talk about that, but it would have been maybe nice or refreshing if we could have a book that talked about Oscar Wilde as a talented artist, and it talked about his life and it talked about important women in his life without having this constant overhanging dread of us knowing what would happen to him. Because I feel like that came through even in parts of the book where it wasn't relevant. Like, there were definitely chapters where I think that was relevant and it should have been discussed, which Eleanor Fitzsimons did. But there were quite a few places where it didn't feel necessary to connect what she was talking about to the inevitable end of Oscar Wilde, and I just wish we maybe wouldn't have done that. And even up to like the end of this book, so the end of this book basically ends with Oscar Wilde's death and kind of tying that back to some of the women in his life and everything, so that, you know, that's fine. But then like the epilogue chapter is about Oscar Wilde's niece, who also had a horribly depressing life and death. And I just felt like that was a very odd choice, because that was the only time his niece was like talked about or covered in the book, and it just felt like an unnecessary note to end the book on. Like, I'm not really sure what our feeling should have been coming away from the end of this book. And another quick note about the content of this book is this book kind of spoiled the plays and stories of Oscar Wilde that it talked about, which I have noticed that's not unusual in nonfiction. With this one, I noticed it even more than some others. Like, if you haven't read Oscar Wilde's play that Eleanor Fitzsimons is using as an example, it's gonna completely spoil like the majority of the plot, which I think is a shame, because I have really enjoyed going into his plays not knowing how they ended. So just keep in mind, if you have no knowledge of his work, then maybe don't pick up this book yet. And even to the extent of like his lesser known fairy tales and short stories, even those were spoiled. So I thought that was kind of a little unnecessary. I think maybe they could have been used as examples without completely giving everything away, but I don't know. So overall, you can probably tell I had quite a few mixed feelings about this book. There were a lot of things I loved. There were a lot of things that I think could have been done better, or that kind of detracted from my experience. But overall, I am really glad I read it. I could see myself even returning to it, and certainly to certain quotations or examples or chapters on interesting women. Like I said, some of those really detailed side stories were some of my favorite parts of the book. Like, I absolutely loved hearing about Lily Langtry and Ellen Terry and Sarah Bernhardt. I think were the three famous women actresses, like basically the prototypes of theater celebrities, or acting celebrities, I guess, since unfortunately theater actors don't often get that level of attention. I think it was those three women that the book talked about, and the press and other people were always trying to pit them against each other and talk about this big rivalry that they had. And these women just really respected each other and enjoyed each other's company. They would come to each other's performances. They would talk about how beautiful and talented the others were. It was just like really nice to see that example of like women supporting women even in such a cutthroat business. So things like that, like there are these little sections or chapters that I could definitely see myself returning to. So I might reread this book at some point and maybe just skim the excessively detailed parts that didn't interest me as much. As for who I would recommend this to, I think if you have any interest in Oscar Wilde, definitely check this book out. I think if you're interested in reading about the women connected to famous men in history, I think you would really enjoy this. Like I said, I think you would get the most out of this book if you're already familiar with a decent number of Oscar Wilde's plays, at least some of his more well-known ones. Like Importance of Being Earnest, Lady Windermere's Fan, A Woman of No Importance, and An Ideal Husband are the ones I can remember off the top of my head, in addition to some of his fairy tales like The Little Prince, that collection. So if you already have a familiarity with his work, I think you would get the most out of this, but I also don't think it's a necessity. Like if you're just getting interested in Oscar Wilde or the women in his life, or again, you're interested in feminist history, I think you could still really enjoy this book even if you don't have all of that background knowledge. Like I haven't read his short stories yet, I really want to, and I was still able to get a lot out of this book, I think. So overall, I gave Wild Women 3.5 stars. Please let me know if you guys have read this book, what you thought of it, or if you're planning to pick it up now. I definitely had an interesting and somewhat mixed experience with it, but overall I would definitely say more positive than negative. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you soon with another video, and I hope you love the next book you read. Bye!